Tonight, we travel back to the final days of ancient Egypt, to the rise and fall of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh, a queen of beauty, power, and ambition, who stood against the empire of Rome and became a legend. If you enjoy calm stories from history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me here at the King's Historian, where the past whispers you to sleep. Egypt, by the middle of the 1st century BCE, was still glittering in the sun, but that glitter hid cracks beneath the gold. Once the mightiest kingdom on earth, it now leaned quietly on the shoulder of Rome, hoping the Romans wouldn't notice how weak it had become. The pyramids still caught the sunrise, but the treasure chambers were emptier, and the priests prayed to gods that fewer and fewer people remembered. Yet along the Nile, the people still dreamed of greatness, whispering that someday another true pharaoh might rise. Long before Cleopatra, Egypt had already traded its crown to foreigners. When Alexander the Great swept through the desert in 332 BCE, he left behind not only Greek soldiers but a whole Greek dynasty. They called themselves the Ptolemies, and for 300 years they ruled from the marble-lined city of Alexandria, a city that smelled of sea salt, papyrus, and ambition. The Ptolemies spoke Greek, not Egyptian, and preferred wine to beer, yet they wore crowns shaped like cobras and called themselves pharaohs anyway. Into that strange mix of sand and marble, Cleopatra VII Philippita was born around 69 BCE. Her palace window looked out over a harbour where traders shouted in half a dozen languages. As a child, she heard Greek philosophers argue with Egyptian priests, and probably thought, well, someone needs to run this circus. She wasn't the kind to sit quietly while men explained the world to her. Cleopatra's education would put most scholars to shame. She studied mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and the art of persuasion, because ruling Egypt required more than eyeliner and a nice headdress. She learned to speak Egyptian fluently, the first of her Greek family to do so. That alone made people love her. To them, she wasn't just a foreign queen, but a voice that sounded like home. When she spoke, the Nile seemed to pause and listen. Ronahawk, by the time she was 15, Cleopatra already understood the kingdom better than most of its ministers. Egypt was rich in crops and gold, but poor in unity. Corruption bloomed like algae in the canals. Her father Ptolemy XII Auletes, nicknamed the flute player, was more interested in Roman approval than Egyptian stability. Cleopatra watched him bow and flatter Roman generals, realizing that her father's crown sat on Rome's approval, not Egypt's soil. When her father died, Cleopatra was just 18, and the royal court became a battlefield of whispers. By tradition, she had to share the throne with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, a boy more puppet than ruler. The palace soon filled with scheming advisors who told the young king that Cleopatra was too ambitious, too clever, and worst of all, too popular. Within months she was forced out of Alexandria, her face scraped off temple walls like a fallen god. Exile didn't break her, it sharpened her. Cleopatra set up camp in Syria and began recruiting an army. She met with mercenaries, traders, and old loyalists who still believed in her. She promised them not just gold, but a reborn Egypt. Every night she looked west, toward the Nile, and swore she'd return. "They'll miss me when their new queen can't even read her own tax scrolls," she might have muttered with a smirk. Meanwhile, Rome watched everything like a cat eyeing a birdcage. Egypt's wealth tempted every Roman general who needed gold for his next civil war. Julius Caesar was busy fighting Pompey for control of the Republic, and both men wanted Egypt's ships and money. Cleopatra knew that aligning with the right Roman could save her crown or cost her life. It was a gamble only she dared play. Still in exile, Cleopatra kept studying Rome from afar. She learned their language, their politics, even their egos. She understood that Roman men liked women who seemed to need them but secretly didn't. It was a dangerous kind of wisdom. She wasn't plotting to be anyone's mistress, she was preparing to be Egypt's salvation. History would later reduce her to beauty and romance, but her real weapon was intelligence. So when the dust of war began to drift toward Egypt, and word spread that Julius Caesar himself was sailing to Alexandria, Cleopatra knew her moment had come. She would return, not as a runaway queen but as a storm in silk. The fading kingdom of Egypt was about to meet the most brilliant mind it had left, and Rome was about to learn that the last pharaoh didn't bow easily. When Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, the city was already simmering like a pot left too long on the fire. The streets bustled with merchants, soldiers, and gossip, everyone whispering about who should truly wear the crown. The Nile glittered peacefully, pretending not to notice the chaos on its banks. Egypt's royal family, meanwhile, was eating itself alive from the inside. A young queen and her even younger brother were locked in a silent war, where smiles hid daggers. Cleopatra's little brother, Ptolemy XIII, was barely 13 and already convinced he was a god. Of course, it wasn't really his idea. It was the whispers of power-hungry advisors who preferred a child king they could control. They told him Cleopatra wanted his throne. He believed them, mostly because he wanted to. Cleopatra, on the other hand, had actual work to do: feed her people, fix Egypt's debts, and keep Rome from swallowing her country whole. Unfortunately, royal brothers rarely appreciate multitasking sisters. Cleopatra wasn't the type to sit quietly while men plotted her downfall. She gathered her few loyal officials and doubled down on ruling as if nothing was wrong. Every decree carried her royal seal. Every shipment of grain bore her mark. The people loved her confidence. It reminded them of Egypt's better days. But the palace corridors buzzed with jealousy. Power, like perfume, tends to draw unwanted attention. Egypt's economy was falling apart faster than a badly built pyramid. Years of war and Roman friendship had drained the treasury. Cleopatra needed allies, not enemies. She tried diplomacy, trading promises and charm with foreign envoys. But in the marble courts of Alexandria, her enemies were multiplying faster than priests at a festival. The whispers grew louder. She's too clever, too bold, too much. And in ancient politics, too much was often fatal. Then came the moment that broke everything. Ptolemy's advisors, especially a cunning man named Pothinus, accused Cleopatra of plotting to seize total power. Before she could react, guards surrounded her quarters. Her own brother had turned on her. One night, under the flicker of oil lamps, Cleopatra fled the palace disguised as a servant. The Queen of Egypt slipped out the back door of her own kingdom. She rode east toward the desert, her small entourage kicking up clouds of dust. The sands stretched endlessly, glowing silver under the moon. Somewhere behind her, Alexandria still glittered like a jewel, but its sparkle now felt cruel. Cleopatra wasn't beaten, just exiled. The desert winds whispered promises that she would return, stronger and far more dangerous. She set up camp in Syria, gathering mercenaries and loyal Egyptians who had followed her into exile. Cleopatra became both queen and commander, sitting around campfires studying battle maps. She wasn't dreaming of revenge, she was planning efficiency. Rome might respect armies, but it worshipped money, and Cleopatra knew she could buy both. She started minting coins with her face on them, sending a clear message to Egypt and Rome alike. The queen still reigns. Back in Alexandria, chaos reigned. Ptolemy's court turned into a game of paranoia. Advisors accused each other of treason, soldiers went unpaid, and grain prices soared. The people began whispering Cleopatra's name again, not as a villain but as a savior. Egypt, it seemed, preferred a capable queen to a clueless boy king. The Nile itself, calm and eternal, seemed to be waiting for her return. Then came the twist no one in Egypt saw coming. Rome's civil war landed right on their doorstep. Julius Caesar had defeated Pompey in battle, and Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge. Ptolemy's advisors, eager to please Rome's new master, decided to impress Caesar with a gift. They had Pompey murdered on the beach. When Caesar arrived and saw his enemy's severed head, he was not impressed, he was furious. Alexandria had just stepped into Rome's thunderstorm, and that's when Cleopatra saw her chance. While her brother's court scrambled to apologize to Caesar, she was quietly preparing her grand return. She knew Rome's greatest general wouldn't be swayed by flattery alone. He respected courage and spectacle. Soon she would roll herself up in a carpet, sneak past enemy guards, and meet the most powerful man in the world face to face. Egypt's lost queen was about to make the comeback of the century. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was the heartbeat of Egypt. Every summer it rose and flooded the farmlands, leaving behind rich black soil that fed the entire kingdom. Egyptians didn't just depend on it, they worshipped it. Without the Nile, there was no Egypt, no grain, no life, and Cleopatra understood that better than any ruler before her. She saw in the river a reflection of herself, calm on the surface, powerful underneath. When Cleopatra returned to power beside Julius Caesar, she made sure everyone knew she was not just a ruler, but a pharaoh. The title still meant something. It was more than politics, it was divine. Pharaohs were children of the gods, voices between heaven and earth. Cleopatra, unlike her Greek ancestors, fully embraced that identity. She dressed like Isis, spoke Egyptian to her people, and revived old rituals that had been forgotten in dusty temple halls. Egypt had a queen who finally felt like Egypt again. She toured the country, not just to collect taxes or greet nobles, but to listen. In every village, farmers bowed low, expecting another foreign monarch with distant manners. Instead, they met a woman who spoke their language, who laughed easily, and who knew when the floods were due better than most priests. To them, Cleopatra wasn't just a ruler, she was a miracle in human form, a pharaoh who finally remembered her people. Inside Alexandria, the royal palace shimmered with wealth and wisdom. Scholars from Greece, Egypt, and even distant Persia gathered there to study, debate, and argue about everything from stars to medicine. Cleopatra loved those debates. She could jump from philosophy to astronomy faster than most men could tie their sandals. And if a scholar ever tried to outtalk her, she'd smile sweetly and correct his math just to keep things humble. Her love for learning wasn't an act, it was her secret weapon. Cleopatra knew that to rule a kingdom surrounded by enemies, she needed knowledge more than soldiers. She learned about crops, the flow of the Nile, trade routes, and even Roman law. The Romans saw her as a temptress, her people saw her as wise. Both were right in a way. Cleopatra understood that ruling was as much performance as politics, but the divine title came with expectations. Egyptians believed the pharaoh was the earthly form of a god, responsible for balance and order, the concept of ma'at, floods that came too early or too late, the pharaoh's fault, plagues, bad harvests, even grumpy priests, also the pharaoh's fault. Cleopatra carried those burdens with grace. If the Nile ran low, she'd ride to the temples herself, offering sacrifices and prayers, not because she had to, but because she believed in the ritual's power to unite her people. While Cleopatra played goddess in Egypt, in Rome people gossiped about her endlessly. Some called her the Eastern Witch, others Queen of the Nile. They couldn't decide whether to envy her or fear her. But what truly bothered Rome was her independence. She didn't beg for approval. She didn't apologize for her wealth, her mind, or her ambition. To Romans that was scandalous. To Egyptians it was divine confidence. In Alexandria, Cleopatra also turned her capital into a symbol of renewal. She ordered temples restored, ports rebuilt, and schools expanded. The city once again became the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean. Ships carrying papyrus, grain, and scholars came and went daily. And at the harbor's edge, the lighthouse of Pharos gleamed, its fire a reminder that Egypt still had light to offer the world. Cleopatra's reign wasn't just survival, it was a revival, but even goddesses get tired. At night, Cleopatra would sometimes walk alone through her palace gardens, watching the Nile shimmer beneath the moon. She knew her peace wouldn't last. Rome's generals were restless, and every friendship with one Roman created an enemy in another. She couldn't control what storms brewed across the sea, but she could make sure Egypt was ready when they arrived. The last pharaoh might have been mortal, but her will was ancient stone. The people began to call her the living Isis. To them she wasn't just a ruler, she was balance, beauty and wisdom wrapped in human form. The statues carved in her image glowed in temple torchlight, and hymns praised her as the bringer of plenty. Yet Cleopatra knew that divine titles were only as strong as the next harvest or the next Roman fleet. Still, she smiled. The gods might rule the heavens, but Egypt's last pharaoh was doing just fine on earth. When Julius Caesar first stepped onto Egyptian soil in 48 BCE, Alexandria was a city pretending everything was fine. The marble streets still gleamed, the libraries still buzzed with scholars, but underneath, the city was one sharp word away from chaos. Caesar had just finished chasing his old rival Pompey across the Mediterranean. He expected rest and negotiation. Instead, he walked into a family feud wrapped in gold and perfume. When Caesar asked where Pompey was, Ptolemy XIII's advisors proudly presented the answer: Pompey's severed head. They thought it would please him. Instead, Caesar turned pale with disgust. Killing a Roman consul wasn't a favor, it was an insult. The Egyptians watched nervously as Caesar stared down the trembling officials. "You've made a child's mistake," he said quietly. "In a man's game." Alexandria's air suddenly felt thick enough to cut with a dagger. Word spread fast. The Romans had come, and they were angry. Cleopatra, still exiled in the desert, heard the news and saw opportunity glowing like sunlight on the Nile. Caesar wasn't just a general, he was Rome itself, wrapped in armor. If she could win his trust, maybe even his heart, Egypt could rise again. But there was a small problem. She was technically a fugitive. Sneaking into her own palace wasn't exactly easy. Cleopatra decided she would meet Caesar face to face, quietly. She couldn't walk in through the front gate without being arrested, so she came up with a plan so bold it sounds like fiction. She would be smuggled into the palace, wrapped inside a rolled-up carpet. Some versions say it was a linen sack, but a carpet makes for better drama, and Cleopatra always understood drama. That night, under flickering torchlight, 2 of her loyal servants carried the carpet into Caesar's quarters. When they unrolled it, out tumbled Cleopatra herself, graceful, confident, and maybe just a little amused by Caesar's expression. The Roman general, tired from years of war, suddenly found himself facing a queen who was every bit as clever as she was beautiful. He had conquered nations, but he'd never met anyone quite like her. The conversation that followed was less about love and more about strategy. Cleopatra explained her claim to the throne, her exile, and her brother's betrayal. She spoke with poise, reason, and perfect timing, traits Caesar admired in himself. By the time she finished, he wasn't thinking about her beauty, he was thinking about her potential. She wasn't begging for rescue, she was offering partnership. That made all the difference. By morning, the palace buzzed with gossip. The Roman general had sided with the exiled queen. Caesar ordered both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII to appear before him, declaring that he would mediate their dispute. Ptolemy stormed out in a rage, shouting that Rome had been bewitched. Maybe he was right. Cleopatra didn't need armies. She had words that could conquer anyone's defenses. Ptolemy's fury boiled into violence. His generals gathered troops, and soon the palace was surrounded by Egyptian soldiers loyal to the boy king. Caesar and Cleopatra were trapped inside with only a few thousand Romans. Outside, Alexandria's narrow streets became a battlefield. Flames lit up the night as the siege of Alexandria began. Cleopatra had regained her throne, but keeping it would cost blood and fire. The fighting raged for months. Streets that once smelled of myrrh and sea salt now stank of smoke and iron. The Library of Alexandria, one of the wonders of the world, caught fire during the battle. Some said it was Caesar's men who set it accidentally, others blamed Ptolemy's. Either way, thousands of scrolls, poems, and ancient secrets went up in flames. The city wept, and history lost part of its memory. Eventually, Caesar's reinforcements arrived, and Ptolemy XIII tried to flee across the Nile. His escape didn't go well. His boat capsized, and the young king drowned beneath the river's calm surface. Cleopatra emerged victorious, her crown once again gleaming in the Egyptian sun. She stood beside Caesar, both triumphant and unshaken, knowing that history had just changed course. The Queen of the Nile had not only survived, she had rewritten the script. After months of siege, Alexandria finally fell quiet. Smoke still curled from its rooftops and the scent of burnt papyrus lingered like a ghost. But inside the palace, Cleopatra stood tall beside Julius Caesar. Egypt's chaos had been washed away, at least for now. The Nile flowed calm again, and for the first time in years the queen slept in her own bed, without fearing knives in the dark. He needed something to show for it. Cleopatra offered Egypt's loyalty and her heart, if rumor is to be believed. Rome got its grain, and Cleopatra got her throne. It wasn't just a romance, it was a transaction wrapped in silk. Both understood that. But when they talked late into the night, surrounded by the hum of crickets and the scent of lotus flowers, even power seemed to fade into the background. Caesar officially restored Cleopatra to the throne, naming her co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, who was only 12. It was mostly for appearances. The boy king had as much authority as a decorative vase. Cleopatra was the true ruler now, and everyone knew it. To celebrate, she ordered grand processions through the streets of Alexandria with music, gold, and dancers. The people cheered, not for Caesar, but for her. Caesar didn't stay idle. He had Rome's future to reclaim. But before he left, Cleopatra invited him to travel up the Nile with her. It was part romance, part politics, and part ancient tourism. Together they sailed on a luxurious barge trimmed with gold, its purple sails catching the wind. They visited temples older than Rome itself, carved with gods who had watched 1,000 empires rise and fall. Caesar may have ruled the known world, but even he looked small beside the pyramids. The journey up the Nile was a spectacle. Wherever they went, priests bowed and offered gifts, farmers cheered, and children ran alongside the riverbanks, shouting her name. Cleopatra played the part of goddess queen flawlessly, smiling, radiant, untouchable. Caesar, though amused, couldn't help admiring her command over her people. She didn't need legions, she ruled through loyalty, charisma, and performance. In Rome, that was politics. In Egypt, that was magic. By the time they returned to Alexandria, Cleopatra was pregnant. Whispers filled the palace. The Roman conqueror had given Egypt an heir. She called the child Pledine Caesar, but everyone nicknamed him Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. It was a name that would both protect and doom him. Cleopatra hoped her son would one day unite Egypt and Rome, not realizing the world would never allow that kind of peace. When Caesar finally left Egypt, Cleopatra stood on the harbor walls watching his ships shrink into the horizon. She didn't wave, she didn't cry. Queens rarely do. But she must have known their fates were now tied. Egypt had given Rome grain, gold, and perhaps a legend. Rome in return had given her a future and a son who carried the blood of both empires. Cleopatra's rule grew stronger in Caesar's absence. She tightened Egypt's trade routes, restored temples, and minted coins with her face beside the image of Isis. The message was clear. She was both queen and goddess, mortal and divine. When she appeared in public, people dropped to their knees not out of fear but devotion. Egypt, for the first time in decades, felt whole, but not everyone shared the joy. The nobles who had supported Ptolemy XIII still seethed in private. They saw Cleopatra's connection to Rome as dangerous, a leash, not an alliance. Rumors spread that she cared more for Roman power than Egyptian tradition. Cleopatra ignored them. She understood that envy always dresses itself as patriotism. Besides, she had a new empire to charm, Rome itself. So in 46 BCE, Cleopatra set sail for Rome. She arrived not as a conquered queen, but as a guest of Julius Caesar, the most powerful man alive. Behind her came ships heavy with gifts, ivory, gold, exotic animals, and rumors that followed like perfume. Cleopatra had survived war, fire, and betrayal. Now she was sailing into the heart of the empire that would one day destroy her. But for the moment she smiled. Egypt's last pharaoh was on her way to conquer Rome, one dinner party at a time. When Cleopatra's ship glided into Rome's harbor, the city practically stopped breathing. Word spread like wildfire. The Queen of Egypt had arrived. Crowds gathered on the docks, craning their necks to see her. Romans had heard stories about this woman, how she wrapped herself in carpets, charmed generals, and spoke a dozen languages. Some expected a monster, others a goddess. What they saw was a woman who made marble senators forget their speeches. Julius Caesar welcomed her like a queen, not a guest. He gave her a villa across the Tiber River, an elegant estate filled with fountains, gardens, and peacocks. To Rome it looked scandalous. Caesar already had a wife, yet there he was, openly housing a foreign monarch and her young son Caesarion, who just happened to look suspiciously like him. Romans whispered, senators frowned, and Cleopatra smiled. Cleopatra quickly became the talk of the empire. Artists painted her, poets wrote about her, and gossips invented whole new scandals before breakfast. Some claimed she used magic, others said she tamed snakes with her voice. She attended Caesar's public ceremonies draped in gold and jewels, her presence turning every political event into theatre. To her, it wasn't vanity, it was strategy. Appear weak and Rome would crush you. Appear divine, and even Caesar would bow. Behind the gossip, Cleopatra observed everything: Roman laws, debates, and the endless tug-of-war between ambition and loyalty. Rome was magnificent, but fragile. Everyone wanted power, and no one could share it. Cleopatra studied this chaos like a philosopher watching ants argue over crumbs. She admired Caesar's control but recognized the storm beneath it. Rome was powerful, yes, but unstable. Egypt, for all its age, felt steadier than this marble volcano. Caesar, meanwhile, enjoyed showing her off. During his grand public parade, his triumph, he rode through the streets in golden armor, while slaves carried treasures from conquered lands. Cleopatra didn't march beside him. She didn't need to. Everyone already knew she was part of the spectacle. The woman who had once fled her own palace now sat in Rome's front row, watching her ally celebrated as a god. Life, she thought, was full of strange reversals. But not all Romans were cheering. The Senate grew nervous. Caesar's power was growing too large, his pride too visible, and Cleopatra's presence didn't help. They whispered that she had bewitched him, that he meant to make himself king with her as queen. In a republic that prided itself on killing kings, that rumor was poison. Cleopatra could feel the tension thickening like summer heat. Rome smiled in daylight, but plotted in the dark. Cleopatra spent her days balancing diplomacy and motherhood. Caesarion toddled through marble halls, half Egyptian, half Roman, entirely the center of attention. She taught him to speak both languages, to recognize both gods. "You'll rule both worlds someday," she might have whispered, but even then she must have known how dangerous that dream was. The child of two empires was also the threat to both. In 44 BCE, the whispers turned into knives. Caesar was assassinated in the Senate, stabbed by men who claimed to save Rome from tyranny. News of his death rippled through the city like thunder. Cleopatra, realizing what it meant, didn't wait to mourn. She gathered Caesarion, her servants, and her treasures, and slipped out of Rome before anyone could decide she was part of the problem. Rome had killed its ruler, and possibly its only shield against chaos. As her ship drifted away, Cleopatra looked back at the fading lights of Rome. Behind her lay betrayal. Ahead, uncertainty. She had played the game of empires and survived, but now she would have to rebuild alone. The sea wind tangled her hair, and somewhere in the dark waves below, the gods of Egypt and Rome might have been laughing together. When she reached Alexandria again, her people welcomed her like a returning goddess. The palace gates opened, musicians played, and priests declared that Isis had come home. But Cleopatra's eyes were different now, sharper, older, and carrying the weight of Rome's ghosts. She had seen what power looked like up close, and how easily it could be killed. Egypt had survived without Caesar before, and it would again. The Queen of the Nile was home, and she was not done yet. When Cleopatra returned to Egypt, the air smelled different. The desert wind carried dust instead of incense, and the people's cheers echoed with a note of relief more than celebration. Egypt had missed her, but the world she came back to was no longer the same. Rome was tearing itself apart. Caesar was dead, and his killers called themselves saviors. Cleopatra had survived one civil war. Now she watched another begin from across the sea. The nobles argued over taxes, priests fought over temple privileges, and the people grumbled about food prices. Cleopatra had ruled with both charm and discipline, but power never truly sleeps. It just shifts hands when the queen isn't watching. Now she had to reassert control, and she did it the same way she did everything, with intelligence and a smile that said, "Try me if you dare." She increased grain shipments to Rome, earning goodwill from the new rulers while keeping Egypt's economy stable. The people who had feared famine began to trust her again. A full stomach, she told her advisors, makes a loyal citizen. It was a simple truth that most kings seemed to forget. Cleopatra didn't. But while Egypt steadied itself, Rome descended into madness. The assassins of Caesar fled, and new alliances formed like shifting desert sands. Out of the chaos rose three men calling themselves the Second Triumvirate: Octavian, Caesar's young adopted heir, Mark Antony, his loyal general, and Lepidus, who mostly tried not to get crushed between the other two. Cleopatra watched carefully. She knew one of these men would decide Egypt's fate. The question was, which one? Octavian was cold and calculating, a politician born with ice in his veins. Lepidus was harmless. But Mark Antony, he was different. Bold, charming, reckless, and famous for both bravery and bad decisions. Cleopatra had heard stories of him long before they met. Some said he was Rome's greatest soldier, others said he was Rome's biggest headache. Either way, she knew one thing: men like Antony could be guided, if you understood what drove them. Cleopatra didn't rush. She ruled calmly, repairing temples, rebuilding trade routes, and strengthening Egypt's army. She also began stockpiling wealth, because in a world ruled by Romans, money was the sharpest weapon. Her diplomats brought news daily. Antony and Octavian had defeated Caesar's assassins and divided the Roman world between them. Rome now had two rulers who trusted each other about as much as cats trust baths. Then, in 41 BCE, a messenger arrived from Rome with a summons. Mark Antony wanted to meet the Queen of Egypt. Cleopatra smiled when she read it. "Ah," she said softly, "Rome comes calling again." She knew exactly what this meeting meant: another test, another alliance, maybe another danger. But if Antony expected her to come begging for favor, he clearly hadn't read the room or the woman. Her advisors urged caution. "The Romans are unpredictable," one warned. Cleopatra nodded, but her eyes gleamed. "So am I," she replied. She began planning her entrance. Antony was staying in the city of Tarsus, and if Rome wanted a queen, she would give them a performance worthy of legend. The last time she'd met a Roman general, she'd rolled herself into a carpet. This time she would arrive as a goddess. As her ships were readied, Cleopatra stood at the harbor, watching the Nile shimmer beneath the setting sun. Somewhere beyond those waters waited a man who could shape her kingdom's future. But Cleopatra had no fear. She had survived betrayal, war, and Rome itself. What was one more general? She turned to her attendants and said, "Make sure the sails are purple. Let him smell Egypt before he even sees me." As night fell, her ships slipped out into the Mediterranean, torches flickering like stars across the dark waves. The sea wind carried the scent of Egypt, lotus, spice, and something dangerous. Cleopatra stood at the prow, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She wasn't just sailing toward Mark Antony, she was sailing toward the next chapter of her legend. Mark Antony had seen war, rebellion, and betrayal, but he had never seen anything like Cleopatra's arrival in Tarsus. The city was already buzzing when her ships appeared on the horizon. Sailors stopped mid-work and merchants forgot to haggle. Cleopatra's flagship drifted down the river like a dream carved out of gold. Its sails dyed deep purple, the color of royalty and danger. The air smelled of incense and honey. Rome had sent for a queen and Egypt delivered a goddess. Cleopatra reclined beneath a canopy of gold, dressed as Isis, the goddess of magic and life. Her attendants fanned her with ostrich feathers, and music floated over the water like perfume. When her ship docked, she didn't rush to greet Antony, she simply waited. After all, if a Roman general wanted an audience with Egypt, he could walk to her throne. The crowd parted as Antony approached, half awed, half amused. He thought he'd seen spectacle before, but this was art. Antony had expected another ambitious ruler with polished words and desperate eyes. Instead, he found wit sharper than his sword. Cleopatra greeted him not with submission, but with a toast. "You summoned me to answer for my loyalty," she said, smiling, "and here I am to test yours." Antony laughed, genuinely. It was the first honest laugh he'd had in months. The floor glittered with crushed pearl dust, the air shimmered with perfume, and servants poured wine like rivers. Cleopatra knew how to weaponize luxury. Every bite, every smile, every glance was calculated to remind Antony that he was not in Rome anymore. He was in Egypt's world now. But what truly captured Antony wasn't the gold, it was the conversation. Cleopatra could talk politics one moment and tell a joke the next. She could discuss trade routes and then pivot to philosophy without missing a beat. She laughed at Roman arrogance but also praised their discipline. By the time the wine ran out, Antony wasn't sure whether he'd been seduced, educated, or conquered, possibly all three. In the following days, Antony and Cleopatra became inseparable. He followed her through the streets of Tarsus, through temples and gardens, laughing and arguing in equal measure. She called him the Roman Dionysus, half god, half fool, and he adored it. When they parted, she invited him to visit Alexandria. "Come see a real city," she teased. "Yours are all marble and politics, mine is sunlight and stories." When Antony finally sailed for Egypt, he found that her promise wasn't an exaggeration. Alexandria dazzled him. Its harbor was lined with marble palaces, its streets filled with music and color. The lighthouse of Pharaoh burned bright over the water, like a torch held by the gods. And waiting at the palace gates was Cleopatra, radiant and calm, as if she'd been expecting him since time began. Alexandria swallowed Antony whole. Days became feasts, nights became laughter and dancing. Cleopatra showed him Egypt, not as a kingdom to be ruled, but as a legend to be lived. They hunted together in the desert, fished on the Nile, and held mock court sessions where Antony played the fool and Cleopatra the judge. Rome called it decadence, Egypt called it Tuesday. Yet beneath the games was strategy. Cleopatra understood Antony's weaknesses, his need for admiration, his hunger for glory, his soft spot for beauty and laughter. She gave him all of it, but on her terms. He might have thought he was the conqueror, but Egypt knew the truth. Antony had been conquered with grace. As summer faded, the world beyond their palace walls waited impatiently. Rome was still fractured, and Antony's co-ruler Octavian was already growing suspicious. But for now, Antony didn't care. Cleopatra had shown him a life worth more than power, a life drenched in color and warmth and danger. The Queen of the Nile had met her match, and together they were about to make history's most unforgettable alliance. By the time autumn warmed the Nile, Cleopatra and Mark Antony had built an empire of laughter and luxury. The streets of Alexandria glowed with festivals, and the palace halls never slept. The two of them hosted feasts that lasted until sunrise, where gold plates overflowed and wine never stopped flowing. But behind the laughter, something deeper stirred. Two rulers, two worlds, trying to find a way to fit together without breaking. They formed what the people called the Inimitable Livers, a private club for the rich and reckless. Every night was a performance. Cleopatra dressed as Venus, Antony as Bacchus, god of wine and madness. They'd roam the streets in disguise, mingling with fishermen and bakers, drinking cheap ale just to see how ordinary people lived. For a queen and a general, it was both foolish and freeing. History would later call them decadent, maybe, but they were also alive in a way few rulers ever were. Antony adored Cleopatra's wit as much as her beauty. She could quote Homer, debate philosophy, and still tease him about his terrible singing voice. He had conquered a dozen nations, yet he often joked that he'd finally met his superior. Cleopatra, meanwhile, saw in Antony something rare, a Roman who actually understood joy. Together they were unstoppable, or so they thought. Cleopatra's influence over Antony grew quickly. She reminded him that Egypt wasn't just a lover's retreat, it was a key to the East. With her ships, her gold and her grain, Antony could rival Octavian back in Rome. He began to listen. He sent orders to his generals, favoring Alexandria's interests. In return, Cleopatra promised loyalty, resources, and charm enough to silence the Senate's sneers. Love might have fueled it, but politics always steered it. Their great general, was living in luxury, dressed in Egyptian silk, worshipping strange gods, and following a queen who seemed to hypnotize him. Roman poets began calling Cleopatra the Serpent of the Nile. Octavian, cold and calculating as ever, quietly collected those stories like arrows for later use. Propaganda, after all, was Rome's favorite weapon. Cleopatra and Antony didn't care. They had children to raise and kingdoms to run. In 40 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, named after the sun and the moon. The symbolism was no accident. Together with Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, Cleopatra now had heirs who connected her to both of Rome's greatest men. She wasn't just playing politics anymore, she was shaping dynasties. Antony eventually had to return to Rome to deal with politics and his Roman wife Octavia, who was conveniently Octavian's sister. Cleopatra knew what that meant. Rome would try to tame him. She let him go, but not without a gift, a golden throne, small enough to travel with him, so he'd never forget which queen truly ruled his heart. And for a while it worked. But distance is the enemy of devotion, and Octavian was an expert at whispering poison into empty spaces. While Antony tried to mend peace in Rome, Octavian spread rumors like wildfire. He claimed Cleopatra had bewitched Antony with witchcraft, that she was draining Rome's wealth, that she planned to crown herself empress. Rome's people loved gossip, and soon Cleopatra became the villain of every story told over dinner. She didn't care what Rome thought, but Antony would. When Antony finally returned to Egypt, he looked older, warier but still hers. Cleopatra greeted him not with tears, but with celebration. She threw feasts for his arrival, decorated the city, and made sure everyone in Alexandria knew their king had come home. The Nile glittered with lights that night, and the city seemed to breathe again. Egypt had its rulers, and for now love had its empire. As they stood together on the palace balcony overlooking the city, Cleopatra turned to Antony and said softly, "Rome will never understand us." He laughed. "Then we'll make our own Rome." Below them, the people danced, the music rose, and the night stretched long and golden. For a brief moment, the world belonged to them. Two lovers holding hands at the edge of history, unaware that history was already writing their fall. By 34 BCE, Cleopatra and Mark Antony were no longer just lovers. They were rulers of half the known world. Their palace in Alexandria had become a center of both romance and strategy, filled with generals, philosophers, and gossipers. But Cleopatra had something grander in mind. Love was fine, but legacy was better. If she couldn't make Rome love her, she would make the world remember her. He needed money, soldiers, and legitimacy, and Cleopatra could give him all three. Together they planned a public ceremony unlike anything Alexandria had ever seen. They called it the Donations of Alexandria. Part religious ritual, part political theatre, and all spectacle. Cleopatra would appear as a goddess, Antony as her consort, and their children as the heirs of a reborn empire. When the day came, the city pulsed with excitement. The square outside the palace filled with citizens and soldiers. Perfume and incense drifted through the air, and drums echoed down the marble streets. On a towering platform draped in silk, Cleopatra appeared dressed as Isis, her crown gleaming with jewels, her face calm as stone. The crowd fell silent. Even the Nile seemed to hold its breath. Beside her, Antony announced the New World Order. To their children, he granted kingdoms as if they were party favors. Alexander Helios, the sun, received Armenia and the lands eastward. Cleopatra Selene, the moon, was given Cyrene and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus, their youngest, got Syria and Cilicia. And over all of them, Cleopatra was declared Queen of Kings, ruler of rulers, mother of gods. Rome gasped. Egypt roared. To the Egyptians, it was glorious, a return to divine order, with the Queen of the Nile restored to her rightful majesty. But to Rome, it was an outrage. Cleopatra's children were half Roman, half Egyptian, and their inheritance came from territories Rome considered its own. The Senate fumed. Octavian sharpened his words like blades. Cleopatra hadn't just defied him, she'd humiliated him. Octavian, cold and calculating, saw his chance. He began spreading rumors that Antony had gone mad under Cleopatra's spell, that he'd abandoned Roman values for Egyptian decadence. Pamphlets circulated in the streets, drawings of Cleopatra feeding Antony grapes while he wore silk robes, absurd stories of temples built to her vanity. None of it was true, but it didn't matter. In politics, truth is often optional. Antony laughed off the insults at first. "Let them talk," he said. They talked about Caesar too. But Cleopatra knew better. She had seen how Rome turned adoration into murder. She urged Antony to prepare, build alliances, secure Egypt's borders, and remember that Rome forgave nothing. Still, when he looked at her, he smiled. "If Rome wants a war," he said, "they'll have to sail through paradise first." Cleopatra knew he was half right. Paradise could hold back armies for only so long. She began reinforcing Egypt's fleets, ordering new warships built along the Nile. Her workers hammered and carved day and night, their chants echoing through the delta. Egypt had not fought a major war in generations, but its queen was preparing for the inevitable. In private, though, Cleopatra's confidence flickered. She could see the storm gathering across the Mediterranean. Rome wasn't just one man anymore. It was a machine, and it was learning to hate her. But she refused to bend. "I was born a queen," she told her handmaid Charmian one night. "If I die, it will be as one." Charmian bowed her head. "Then Egypt will die beautifully." And so, with gold in her vaults and gods on her side, or so she hoped, Cleopatra stared toward the horizon where Rome waited. She had faced Caesar and won, faced exile and returned, faced death and turned it into a legend. Now she was about to face something colder than any man's sword, the ambition of an empire that feared her. By 32 BCE, the laughter had faded. The wine had soured. Cleopatra and Mark Antony still ruled from Alexandria, but the shadow of Rome stretched long across the Mediterranean. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, was no longer content with insults. He wanted control. The triumvirate had dissolved, and there was room for only one ruler of Rome. Antony and Cleopatra stood directly in his way. Octavian's strategy was simple: turn Rome against Antony. He told the Senate that Antony had fallen under Cleopatra's spell, that he'd betrayed his Roman wife and was plotting to give power to a foreign queen. It was part truth, part theatre, but Rome loved theatre. By the time he finished, Antony wasn't a general anymore. He was a warning story. Cleopatra wasn't a monarch, she was a monster. Then came the masterstroke. Octavian read Antony's private will aloud to the Roman people, stolen of course from the Temple of Vesta. In it, Antony requested to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra. The crowd gasped. To Romans, that wasn't love, it was treason. Cleopatra's name, once whispered in admiration, now hissed through the streets like smoke. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra knew what was coming. She had seen it all before, how Rome dealt with threats it couldn't control. She called Antony to her private chambers. "You know what they'll do," she said quietly. "They'll call it justice, but it's revenge." Antony, exhausted and proud, simply replied, "Then we'll give them a war worth remembering." Cleopatra began preparing Egypt's fleet. Every ship along the Nile was refitted for war. Blacksmiths hammered day and night, priests blessed the soldiers, and the docks smelled of tar, sweat, and prophecy. She even trained her own sailors, men and women alike, to row in perfect rhythm. "Rome may have numbers," she said, "but Egypt has gods." Her people believed her. Antony, meanwhile, struggled to rebuild his army. Many of his Roman legions had deserted to Octavian, tired of politics disguised as loyalty. The men who remained were loyal to Antony himself, but not always to Cleopatra. In the camps, whispers spread. "The queen commands too much. She thinks she's Caesar." Antony ignored them, but Cleopatra didn't. She'd learned long ago that whispers could kill. To rally his soldiers, Antony threw grand feasts and spoke of honor, glory, and destiny, though destiny, it seemed, had other plans. Cleopatra matched his optimism with gifts of gold and food. Together they tried to rekindle the old magic, but the laughter never came as easily as it once did. War makes even love feel heavy. In the summer of 31 BCE, their combined forces met Octavian's navy near the coast of Actium, in western Greece. The wind was hot, the sea restless. Cleopatra's golden ships gleamed like sunlit jewels, while Antony's Roman galleys bristled with soldiers. On the opposite side, Octavian's fleet waited, calm and patient, commanded by his brilliant Admiral Agrippa. Two worlds faced each other across the waves, one fading, one rising. Before the battle, Cleopatra and Antony stood together on the deck of her flagship. "We've come too far to turn back," Antony said. Cleopatra smiled faintly. "You Romans always say that right before disaster." He laughed, kissed her hand, and looked out at the horizon. The sea smelled of salt and fate. En route as the drums of war began to beat, Cleopatra stood tall beside Antony, her crown glinting in the light. Somewhere across the waves, Octavian watched, already dreaming of victory. The wind picked up, the sails strained. And in that moment before the clash, the last pharaoh of Egypt looked toward Rome's future and smiled as if she already knew how the story would end. The morning of September 2nd, 31 BCE, broke warm and windless. The sea off Actium shimmered like polished glass, and in that glass two worlds stared at each other. On one side, Octavian's fleet, disciplined, lean and deadly. On the other, Cleopatra and Mark Antony, commanding ships gilded with gold and carved in the shapes of gods. Egypt's flags fluttered lazily in the still air, as if waiting to see which way fate would blow. The wind was Antony's enemy that day. It never came. His larger ships sat heavy and sluggish, while Octavian's smaller galleys darted like insects across the water. Cleopatra's flagship, glittering under the sun, anchored near the center of the line. Her soldiers were brave, her sailors loyal, but the sea, as ever, had its own loyalties. Antony stood on deck shouting orders, his voice hoarse from salt and fury. He had faced worse odds before, but never with so much to lose. Cleopatra watched him quietly, her hand resting on the rail. To the sailors, she looked serene, almost divine. Inside, she was calculating. She had seen battles won and lost before, but this one would decide whether Egypt lived or died. When the fighting began, the sea turned to chaos. Arrows hissed through the air, catapults hurled flaming pitch, and the shouts of men merged with the crash of oars. Cleopatra's ships held firm at first, their bright hulls cutting through the water like knives. But the Romans were relentless. Agrippa's tactics, swift, precise, merciless, slowly tightened around them like a net. The Nile-born sailors fought bravely, but exhaustion began to spread. Antony's heavy galleys couldn't maneuver. Cleopatra's smaller fleet took the brunt of the assault. She watched as one of her own warships burst into flames, its mast collapsing into the sea. The smoke curled upward, black and thick, blotting out the sun. For the first time, even she wondered if the gods were still listening. Then came the moment that history never forgot. Cleopatra, seeing the battle lost, gave the order to retreat. Her ships broke formation and sailed south toward the open sea. Antony, catching sight of her golden sails, froze. Every instinct screamed at him to hold his ground, but his heart, foolish and loyal, followed her. He turned his own flagship and chased her through the smoke. His fleet, confused, began to collapse. To Antony's men it felt like betrayal. Their commander had abandoned them mid-fight. Some cursed Cleopatra's name, others simply stared in disbelief as the enemy closed in. Octavian's fleet seized the moment, surrounding the scattered Egyptian ships. The Battle of Actium was over, not with a bang, but with a heartbreak. Antony's pursuit of Cleopatra was not planned, it was instinct. When he caught up to her ship miles away, she met him on the deck, eyes calm, voice steady. "I would not have you die for me," she said. He looked at her, hollow and breathless. "Then what do we have left?" "Egypt," she whispered, "and each other." It sounded noble, but both knew it wasn't enough. Behind them, the sea carried wreckage and memory. Thousands of soldiers drowned that day. Romans, Egyptians, Greeks, all swallowed by the same indifferent water. The waves rolled gently again, as if nothing had happened. The gods, if they had watched, remained silent. When their ships finally reached Egypt, Cleopatra stood on the deck, looking back toward the fading horizon. The wind was warm again, soft against her face. She had gambled everything, love, pride and empire, and lost. But she still had Alexandria, still had her throne, and for now, still had Mark Antony. The war wasn't over yet, but the end had already begun. When Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria after Actium, the city welcomed them not with cheers but with silence. The people could see the truth in the queen's eyes, and it was written there like prophecy. Egypt had lost. The harbour was nearly empty, the treasury drained, and Rome was coming. The golden city by the Nile still glittered, but it was the shimmer of a candle before it goes out. Cleopatra retreated into her palace and began rebuilding what little strength she could. She sent envoys to distant kingdoms, offered gold for alliances, and prayed to gods that had long stopped answering. Antony, meanwhile, sank into despair. The general who had once commanded legions now spent his nights staring at the dark river, muttering Caesar's name, then hers, then Rome's. The Queen of Egypt had returned home with a broken empire and a broken man. Merchants hid their silver, soldiers deserted, and priests murmured old prayers in darkened temples. Cleopatra walked among them, veiled but unmistakable. The people still bowed, but their eyes were full of pity instead of awe. The queen who had once seemed eternal now looked human, and that, somehow, was the saddest part. Then came the news she had dreaded. Octavian's army had landed in Egypt. His generals moved swiftly, their soldiers disciplined, their victory almost certain. Cleopatra gathered what forces remained, more for dignity than hope. "We will not greet him on our knees," she told her commanders. Her voice was steady, her crown heavy. The battle for Alexandria was short and brutal. Octavian's forces swept through the outskirts, cutting down resistance like wheat. Smoke rose over the city's skyline, and the sound of steel echoed down marble streets. Cleopatra watched from her palace balcony as her city burned, her face unreadable. "So this is how gods die," she murmured. Rat. In the chaos, Antony tried one last act of defiance. Gathering a handful of loyal men, he charged the enemy lines, hoping to reclaim some forgotten glory. But fate doesn't recycle miracles. Surrounded and bleeding, he was carried back to the palace, pale as marble. "Tell her I fought," he whispered to his soldiers. "Tell her I didn't run." When word reached Cleopatra, she locked herself in the mausoleum she had built for herself years earlier, a monument of gold and stone meant for eternity. She sent word to Antony that she was dead, hoping to spare him from Octavian's humiliation. When the message reached him, he took his sword and fell upon it. Even his death was loyal, if not wise. But Antony didn't die right away. His men carried him, bleeding, to Cleopatra's mausoleum. When she saw him, she cried out and tore at her robes, perhaps the first time anyone had seen her lose composure. She lifted him in her arms, and he smiled faintly. "I've lived for honor," he whispered, "and died for love." She pressed her forehead to his, and the world went quiet. When Octavian entered Alexandria, he found the queen guarded within her tomb, surrounded by gold and incense. She tried to negotiate with him, Egypt's wealth for her freedom, but Octavian had come not for gold but for history. He planned to parade her through Rome in chains, a trophy to prove that even queens could bow. Cleopatra listened, smiled politely, and decided she would die on her own terms. That night she ordered her servants to prepare her finest clothes, golden robes, a diadem of pearls and sandals fit for a goddess. "I will not be remembered as a prisoner," she said. When her maid Charmian placed the basket of figs before her, Cleopatra smiled. Inside the basket, hidden among the fruit, was an asp. She took it gently, like an old friend, and pressed it to her arm. The poison was swift. When Octavian's guards found her, she lay still upon her couch, dressed as a queen, her crown perfectly straight. When Octavian entered Cleopatra's tomb, the smell of incense still lingered in the air. The queen lay draped in gold and linen, her crown gleaming faintly in the torchlight. The Romans stood in silence. They had expected a monster, but found a masterpiece instead. Even in death, Cleopatra refused to look defeated. Octavian stared at her for a long time and finally muttered, "She outplayed us all." The two lovers who had defied empires were finally at rest together. Rome's warning and Egypt's elegy. Outside, the city mourned. People lined the streets, laying lotus flowers in the dust. The priests chanted old hymns to Isis, their voices trembling. It wasn't just a queen who had died. It was Egypt's last breath as an independent soul. Octavian took no chances. He ordered Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, to be captured and executed. 2 Caesars, he said, is one too many. The boy, barely 17, died quietly, and with him ended the Ptolemaic line that had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years. The dynasty of Alexander the Great's heirs dissolved into Roman dust. Octavian took the surviving children, Cleopatra Selene, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, to Rome. There he displayed them in his victory parade, dressed in gold chains as symbols of his conquest. The people cheered, not realizing they were witnessing the end of something beautiful. In the crowd, even some Romans turned away. The spectacle was grand, but the glory felt hollow. After the parade, Octavian spared the children, giving them into the care of his sister Octavia, the same woman Antony had once abandoned. History has a cruel sense of humor. Cleopatra Selene, her mother's mirror in wit and poise, grew up in Rome and later married a North African king. For a time she ruled well. A spark of her mother's fire lived on, even under Rome's watchful eyes. Back in Alexandria, Octavian stood at the palace window and gazed at the Nile. "Rome will take care of this place now," he said quietly. Egypt became a Roman province, its gold flowing to Rome, its temples left to crumble, its language fading into history. The city that had once ruled the ancient world became a jewel in someone else's crown. The priests sealed Cleopatra's tomb, its doors covered in hieroglyphs wishing her safe passage to the afterlife. They whispered that she had joined Isis among the stars. Fishermen on the Nile claimed they saw her reflection in the moonlit water, a woman's face, serene and unbroken. The Queen of Egypt was gone, but her legend had already begun. Rome celebrated its victory, of course. Octavian returned home to a hero's welcome, crowned with laurels and showered in praise. The Senate granted him a new title, Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. In killing Egypt's queen, he had also killed the Roman Republic. Cleopatra's death marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the birth of an empire. Years later, poets and historians couldn't stop writing about Cleopatra. To some, she was a temptress, to others, a patriot. To Rome, she was a warning about foreign queens and dangerous beauty. But time, as always, softened the story. What began as scandal turned into legend, and in the quiet pages of history, even her enemies seemed to miss her. In the centuries that followed, Alexandria changed hands many times, but the legend of Cleopatra never faded. Her story drifted through the ages, part myth, part memory, always shimmering like the Nile at sunset. And though empires rise and fall, somewhere in that eternal light, the last pharaoh still stands, smiling as if she knew all along that her name would never die. Time has a way of softening everything, even empires. Long after Cleopatra's death, when Rome's marble turned to dust and its legions faded into legend, her name still shimmered like a mirage on the horizon of history. Kings forgot their crowns, conquerors were buried and forgotten, but the Queen of the Nile refused to vanish. She lingered in art, in whispers and in dreams. The Romans tried to control her story. To them, she was a dangerous woman who seduced great men and nearly toppled a republic. Their poets called her a temptress, their generals cursed her name. But history, like the Nile, never flows in a straight line. For every Roman who painted her as a villain, there were others who saw her as a ruler who dared to stand against the tide. Centuries passed, and the world rediscovered her again and again. Arab scholars wrote of her wisdom. Renaissance artists painted her death with reverence and sorrow. In every retelling, she changed a little. Queen, lover, goddess, martyr, but the heart of her legend never faded. She became not just a woman, but an idea that beauty and intelligence, grace and power, could live in the same soul. Modern historians still argue about her. Was she a patriot or a manipulator? A romantic or a realist? The truth, as always, lies somewhere between. Cleopatra lived in a world built by men who underestimated her, and she beat them at their own game until the very end. She ruled, she loved, she lost, and she became eternal. That's more than most empires ever manage. Even her city refuses to die. Alexandria, battered by centuries, still stands, its streets layered with the bones of every age. Somewhere beneath its markets and churches lies the lost tomb of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, waiting in silence. Archaeologists still search for it, digging through sand and time. They haven't found it yet. Maybe she prefers it that way. Once the world she left behind became Rome's greatest prize. Egypt fed the empire for centuries, its grain and gold fueling Caesar's heirs. Yet the Romans could never truly tame it. The spirit of the Nile, the mystery, the pride, the quiet power remained stubbornly Egyptian. And in that spirit, Cleopatra's shadow lingered, soft as perfume, eternal as sand. Over the centuries, her image transformed. To poets, she was love itself. To painters, beauty. To scholars, ambition. To dreamers, freedom. Cleopatra had become what she always wanted to be, not just a ruler of Egypt, but a symbol that no one could conquer. The last pharaoh had achieved immortality without the help of any god, and perhaps that was her greatest victory. She lived in a world where women were footnotes, yet she wrote her name across the front page of history. The men she knew, Caesar, Antony, Octavian, built empires that crumbled. She built a legend that never will. The gods may have gone quiet, but somewhere they must still whisper her name. If you listen closely, the river still tells her story. It hums softly as it winds past ancient stones and fallen temples, carrying whispers of the queen who once ruled its shores. The reeds sway like courtiers, the waves sparkle like her jewelry. Time may have taken her empire, but it gave her something far rarer: eternity. So when night falls over Egypt and the desert cools, imagine her there somewhere beyond the veil of centuries, smiling as the moonlight touches the river, the last pharaoh, the queen of kings, the woman who defied the world and won the only prize that ever mattered: remembrance. The sands will cover cities, and empires will fade, but Cleopatra will always rise with the Nile.